So to begin with, why are you at the conference today, and what's your interest here?
I think one of the most interesting themes that's emerged over the last couple of years is the medical costs that climate change might actually impose on us as a society. And there's also, of course, the question of what the security costs come from large scale population disruptions and migration and things like that, and disaster recovery and response. But the medical piece, I think, is the most overlooked piece. The huge health advantages of moving to a low carbon world from a high carbon world are underestimated by virtually everybody involved in the problem. So looking at those issues was, to me, the most interesting aspect of today.
And what kind of health advantages are we talking about?
Well, you have dramatically cleaner air. You have dramatically reduced particulate emissions, and there are also now studies that show that we have significantly more higher rates of cancer and other things like that that come out of that. But you have to ask the health professionals that. I mean, it's more that if you look at just for example, West Virginia, where coal in the United States is mined and burned in large scale, the health, the infection rates and the cancer rates and everything else in the places within that catchment area are dramatically higher than the national average. The same thing, of course, is true in China. And so if we start to move to an environment in which we're using non-fossil fuels, all of a sudden air quality goes up dramatically.
And why aren't we seeing this transition to a renewable economy if there are so many benefits associated with it?
Well, first of all, there are not a lot of people who believe in those benefits. And second of all, there are a lot of people who lose in that transition. And transition very rarely happens easily. There's an inertia in the human system. We do the thing that we know how to do. And so I spent a lot of time over the last 5 years looking at what the pathway is from a current high carbon world to a low carbon world. And the fascinating thing is that there is, in fact, a route through the maze that gets you to a more interesting, more prosperous, overall better low carbon world by, let's say, 2050. And so if you just start at a very narrow thing, you look at the power sector, you can in fact build a zero carbon energy system between now and 2050. And in fact, the cost of energy at the end of it will be roughly the same as the cost of energy today. So it's not going to be dramatically more expensive. And the economy will be vastly much better off because we will have built all this new infrastructure, employed lots of people, developed a lot of interesting new technologies and so forth. However, the people who would build that new world are not the people who currently employ thousands of people powering the old world. And so the people who power the old world, of course, have a very strong interest in keeping that old world alive. If you're BP and Shell, maybe you can believe that there's some interesting new pathway for you because you can become a synthetic plastics manufacturer or whatever it is if your oil and fuel is not used to power cars. But if you're a coal company and people are basically saying coal is the problem, you've got a lot to lose. And so you're going to make sure that you're going to do everything in your power not to lose your position to ensure that your asset becomes worth something. Now, how those people sleep at night is another question. I know a guy who's a CEO of a large mining company who became a climate convert because he came home one day and his 12-year-old daughter said to him, "Daddy, why are you killing my generation?" And that sounds kind of silly and flippant, but it flipped him. And he all of a sudden started to look at what, in fact, he could do as the CEO of a mining company to try to build a different kind of economy. And of course, the interesting thing is when you look inside your business, if you're the CEO of a large mining company, it turns out there's a lot you can do. And so there's a transition process that people need to go through where they start to see that they have something to gain from the new world. But there are a lot of people who won't have a lot to gain from the new world, and those people will fight quite hard to keep the old world alive.
And the flip side of the coin, the new technology companies, the companies that are set to benefit, what are the barriers that they face in terms of investing in this new green economy?
They're basically small and poor. And the people they're trying to compete with are big and rich. So you're a solar power developer in California, and you're going to develop some enormous amount of solar power, and you're going to deploy several $1 billion of capital, and it's you and three guys working out of your garage. Or you're BP and you're going to deploy $2 billion into the Gulf of Mexico, and there are 4,000 people working on the project, and you've got all sorts of politicians who think this is fantastic because it's driving employment and economic growth. It's a lot easier to push the narrative through BP than it is to push the narrative from the independent entrepreneur who's doing the new thing. But that's changing because if you start with the things that make money today, so forget about all the renewable stuff that needs subsidy. If you go to the other side of what we think of as the cost curve, and you look at energy efficiency investments, energy efficiency is a fantastic thing. It saves everybody money, it employs people, it creates better working environments. There's kind of nothing really to complain about when you look at energy efficiency. The problem is most people don't believe it works. And what's fascinating is that it does. And when you go and you work in an industrial environment particularly, and you do energy efficiency upgrades, what starts to happen is people start to flip. And all of a sudden they went from thinking this was a thing they didn't want to hear about to all of a sudden being a thing they need to have. And why can't they have it tomorrow? And that starts to happen on national bases. I was in a country, I won't say the name because I can't tell you the story then, but I was in a country last week, and I just by chance, I arrived and I was going to have dinner with some people who work on this issue, and the Minister of Finance had heard that I was in town, and he wanted me to come and see him to talk about job creation from energy efficiency. And we ended up having quite a long conversation about how you could deploy more capital into upgrading the national economy and what impact that would have for national competitiveness. In this particular country, energy is very expensive, and it causes them a problem when they try to create an environment for multinational companies and so forth. We had a good talk for an hour or so. The next day, much to my surprise, I saw the Prime Minister. There are people who are beginning to embrace the notion that this is an economically interesting, intelligent, sustainable path. But it's very hard because those same people, when I leave, will have somebody come in who already employs 4,000 people, who will say, if you make this transition to a low carbon world, I'm going to have to lay off those 4,000 people, and this new guy, whether he's going to employ them or not, isn't clear. And so it's a very risky environment if you're a politician to make bets in. But it's the direction that things will have to go.
And what's the driver for change for businesses? Is it the bottom line? Is it government regulation? What needs to happen to get more businesses acting on this issue?
So I'd say different businesses are motivated by different things. There is a very, very small slice of businesses who say, regulate me, please. But it's not tiny. I mean, it's probably 10% of businesses say, make me do the right thing. That would be great. And really what they're saying is, I'm willing to do the right thing, but unless my competitors do the right thing too, then I can't be expected to do the right thing. So they're saying, create a level playing field for all of us. Then there's a category of businesses who just think that this is actually going to make economic sense for them. And then there's a category of businesses who do this because it excites some group of their stakeholders. Maybe it's their customers, but more often it's actually their employees. It creates a tremendous feeling of pride and belonging and so forth if people can believe in the mission of their business. People don't like working for a business which they feel is doing the wrong things, and people like working for a business that they feel is doing the right things. And so, in fact, this whole new agenda is being seen by a lot of businesses as a way to increase retention, reduce recruiting costs, and things like that. So those are co-benefits that you wouldn't naturally think of, but in fact are driving a lot of businesses today to be a little bit more active.
And what kinds of policy changes and changes in regulation are necessary in order to drive this further?
Well, again, the easiest place to start is the things that make money for society. So energy efficiency is it writ large, meaning vehicle efficiency, industrial efficiency, home efficiency, whatever it is. These are things which people don't do because they're not used to doing them. But if they do them, they're better off. And so politically, forcing people to do those things makes a certain amount of sense. They may not like it at first, but they like it eventually. And so that's a much less risky environment. It gets harder when you talk about diverting public resources into subsidy programs for things that aren't yet economic, but some of that has to happen too. So, and of course, some of those things are politically interesting because governments like to spend money, and they particularly like to spend the money if it's somebody else's. So programs like forcing the utility to pay more for renewable power and things like that, that's a fantastic thing because you don't have to actually spend the money yourself. Governments, I think, need to do a little bit less of that and a little bit more of the things that are economically sensible to begin to build a broader constituency for the change. But unfortunately, the range of policies that is needed is really broad. I mean, the terrible problem with climate change is we don't win it by doing one thing. We win it by doing hundreds of things, and we kind of have to do all 100 of those hundreds things right. And it's a daunting challenge.
And what trajectory do you see over the next 10 years in terms of businesses' role in shaping the response to climate change?
I think I think you'll see more activity happen on the business front than many people expect. Companies are now thinking very, very seriously about the whole broad question of resource efficiency. And they now generally acknowledge that there aren't enough resources in the world for the number of people who are available. The statistic that I find most arresting related to climate change is that today we generate a dollar of GDP globally by emitting 768 grams of carbon. If you look at global population and then you look at the economic aspirations of that global population, by 2050 we have to generate a dollar of economic activity by emitting 8 grams of carbon. So we have to go from 768 to 8. That's a pretty dramatic shift. Businesses may or may not think that climate change is interesting, and they may or may not think that they need to do something about it in the immediate term, but they do understand that resource challenge. They understand that there isn't enough water, there isn't enough steel, there isn't enough aluminum, there isn't enough stuff to support all of those people in the way that we consume today. So if you're going to reach the desired level of prosperity, because I don't think that you can expect that people, particularly in emerging markets, are going to accept any less level of prosperity. You have to figure out how to do that with less inputs. And most businesses now understand that that's what they need to do. They're stumbling towards it. Some are going to go faster than others, but in fact, in the end, it probably becomes a competitive issue to be the most resource efficient producer of whatever you produce in your category.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. Really